Lovely scene, isn't it? Beautiful green grass, blackberry bushes surrounding the lawn. Peaceful. The chaps, gliding a bowling ball across the cropped turf. Couldn't be more pleasant. But this bowling green was originally the tilting ground for the castle. A bit like the local football club, Norman knights turned up regularly to practice cutting off ears, piercing armour with pike or sword. Or even more dramatically, they charged at one another with pointed lances, determined to knock an opponent to the ground, ready to perform the coup de grace, that last fatal plunge of the sword in the unguarded bit of flesh, the throat. Ugh, makes me feel quite faint. But the Knights of 1100 had to be honed to military perfection. Not only was there the odd disgruntled Saxon around, but even his own side could give the king a rough time. And indeed they did. But before we go to another bloody incident on the Lewes High Street, let's stay with the tilting ground for a moment. In the 1700s, the soldiers, who had wielded their swords with such skill, discovered guns and started shooting one another. That more or less ended the fun of charging at one another with horses. And so this bit of real estate was up for grabs, and the local crown bowlers seized the opportunity in 1751 and turned tilting into bowling. But this is Lewes, remember. Nothing is ever what it seems. The horses had ploughed up the ground a bit, so the surface wasn't even. You can see the bumps and ridges across the green. So the type of bowls played on this green was different to any played through the British Isles. And 500 years later, it still is.
It goes way back to medieval times, but so far as we're concerned here, we've been playing here since 1753, and there is some evidence to suggest that in the mid-1600s there was bowls played here. And we're reputed to be the oldest society, sporting society in the world. Very unique, and we're unique in many respects. I mean, firstly, the woods are unique in that most of them over 100 years old. They're lignum vitae, which is very, very hard wood, and that's the reason, of course, they've survived as long as they have. The jack is biased, which is very unusual, and the green is undulating, very undulating. There's not another green anywhere in this country, so far as we know, and it makes for a very fascinating but unique game. One that we can't play any other club because there aren't any that play like this. We have a membership of 50 only or 55 now, because that's all the woods we have. They're handed down from person to person. We have a championship game in the summer because we have a competition throughout the year, which is within the club. And I think the winner of that is not only our own champion, but we can consider he's world champion. As long as we can retain the green, and I think we can retain the green, as long as we can do that, there's no reason why this society shouldn't continue ad infinitum almost. It's a great Lewes establishment.
So bowling in Lewes is completely unique. And very difficult. But back to blood and guts. In the last episode, I spoke of a battle between the king and some of his barons. The king, Henry III, held the castle. Now, as you can see, the castle pokes up into the sky quite a bit. The Motter is a man-made hill. And as you can see, a few hours of overtime were put in to build this pile of dirt. From the top, you can see in every direction for miles. Almost impossible to creep up without being noticed. And there was a moat to cross as well. But it's called Castle Ditch Lane, the name reflecting its purpose all those years ago. The king, rather unsportingly, had more men on his side than the barons. But it seems he fell asleep at the switch, and on that meadow over there, Simon de Montfort drew up his troops and joined battle. Fighting was fierce. After all, they'd all been on their own tilting greens, preparing for such a showdown as this. The battle was short and sharp, and the barons put the royal troops to flight. And they showed no mercy. The priory had been used as a staging post by the king's men, and they now took refuge there. It's little wonder that tilting grounds became bowling greens, because despite all that training, the king's men panicked. Screams of terror from both monks and soldiers echoed around the priory. As burning arrows thudded into thatched roofs, setting the priory buildings afire, fighting spilled over to here, our beloved but bloody High Street. Soldiers were either massacred or crushed to death as they tried to get across the bridge over the River Ouse. For the king, it was a complete disaster.
De Montfort, he split his armies up on the hills behind us in the Chalk Downs. He split his army into three forward not flanks, but bunches of men, you know, groups. And they would have been around 1,500 people in them. So a lot of people. So he had 1,500 people. Then he kept men back for himself. So his left flank went off to Barkham and met Prince Edward, and they went off to Barkham. Prince Edward, being a hothead and chasing them all the way out to Barkham, away from the town, was one of the reasons the king's men lost. Because and they were mounted knights. And then the other two sets came into the town and were met by the king's army and Richard of Alameyn's army on sort of the hills around us, really, because where we are now would have been outside the town.
And it was a pretty bloody war.
It was dreadful. It was absolutely dreadful. It's hard to imagine. Lewes is a little place, and on the hills around Lewes, where most of the fighting was, you know, there were tens of thousands of people trying to kill each other. And it was hand-to-hand close combat. And you didn't often die of wounds on the battlefield immediately. You were usually whacked with a broadsword and you would die of internal bleeding, or you would, have limbs severed and die slow death, or you would die death from infection, etc.
So there you go. Not quite one man, one vote, but some slight recognition that the divine right of kings isn't exactly what the Almighty had in mind. A spark of democracy was ignited, and it happened in Lewes. As usual, this is thirsty work, and I need to take a break. In fact, have a tipple, or perhaps go to the loos.
Don't leave me. There's more blood and gore to come. Oh, Lewis, what a place.